Story 1. The Curse of the Ancient Well. In a remote village, forgotten by time, there was a well that carried a terrible curse. It stood on the outskirts of the village, in a clearing surrounded by twisted trees and always shrouded in a thick mist. The well was very old, so ancient that no one remembered who had built it. The stories surrounding the place were terrifying, as they said that anyone who dared to look inside would never be the same again. Children were warned by their parents never to approach, and the elders avoided talking about it. The well was a symbol of death and destruction, as if something terrible was trapped there, waiting for the right moment to be freed. Carlos, a young newcomer to the village, had always been skeptical of superstitions. He was curious, fascinated by mysteries and ancient legends. As soon as he heard the stories about the well, his curiosity was piqued. The villagers warned him to stay away, but he couldn't resist the urge to discover the truth for himself. "It's just a legend made to scare people," he told himself, ignoring the concerned looks from the villagers. One afternoon, Carlos decided he would visit the well alone. He waited until the sun began to set, as the mist started to spread across the village, believing the eerie atmosphere would add a sense of adventure to his exploration. With a flashlight in hand, he walked along the path leading to the well, his footsteps echoing in the silence of the forest. The walk was peaceful, but as he approached the clearing where the well stood, the air grew heavier, and the temperature dropped suddenly as if the place had a life of its own. Carlos ignored the discomfort and pressed on. When he reached the clearing, the well was there, surrounded by ancient moss-covered stones. It seemed harmless at first glance, but there was something deeply unsettling about the silence that surrounded it. The trees nearby were still, and the wind seemed to have stopped. It was as if time had frozen at that point. Carlos moved slowly, feeling a strange chill crawl up his spine but still convinced that it was all just a silly superstition. He leaned over the edge of the well, shining his flashlight into its depths. The beam of light didn't penetrate very far, as the darkness was thick, resistant to the illumination. For a few moments, he saw nothing but darkness, but then something began to stir below. At first, it was just ripples in the water, as if the bottom had been disturbed by a non-existent breeze. Carlos held his breath. Then he saw the silhouette of something slowly rising, emerging from the bottom of the well. What appeared was a human figure, but distorted, with indistinguishable features, as if the face had been stretched and twisted. The eyes, however, were the most terrifying part, empty, lifeless, yet filled with deep hatred and ancient rage. Carlos stepped back, his heart racing. He tried to convince himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, but what he saw next froze him completely. The figure reached out with a long, deformed arm as if trying to grab him. He heard a low laugh coming from the bottom of the well, which grew louder, filling the clearing. The sound was inhuman, distorted, echoing from all directions. Before he could react, he felt something cold and slimy wrap around his ankles. He looked down and saw black tendrils, emerging from the ground around the well, coiling around his legs. They were slowly pulling him toward the well, and the more he struggled, the stronger the tendrils became. Carlos screamed, but there was no one to hear him. Despair overtook him as he realized he was being dragged into the well. The last thing he saw before being pulled into the darkness was the distorted face of the figure, now much closer, with a wicked smile plastered on its face. The next morning, the villagers noticed that Carlos had not returned. Knowing where he had likely gone, a few brave men made their way to the clearing. There they found the well as ominous as ever, but Carlos had vanished. All that remained was his flashlight lying on the ground and strange drag marks leading into the well. From that day on, the village became even more reserved about the well. The stories intensified and the warnings grew stronger. They say that on the quietest nights, you can hear the distorted laughter coming from the clearing, and if anyone dares to look into the well, they'll see something down there, something patiently waiting for the next curious soul brave enough to approach. Story 2. The Forest of the Lost. In the heart of a vast, shadowy forest, there was a trail that, according to legend, led directly to disappearance. People from the nearby village knew it as the Forest of the Lost, and stories of those who entered and never returned were told for generations. It was believed that the forest had a kind of consciousness, an entity that fed on human souls. It was not just an ordinary forest. It was a place that defied reality and manipulated time, making those who ventured through its paths lose all sense of where they were. Mariana, a fearless explorer, never believed these stories. To her, they were nothing but superstitions fueled by fear of the unknown. Determined to prove that nothing supernatural existed in the forest, she set off alone, armed only with a compass and a map of the area. The villagers watched her with disapproving looks, whispering amongst themselves that she was making a big mistake. The hike through the forest began smoothly. Mariana followed the well-marked trail, the sound of dry leaves underfoot and birdsong keeping her company. But as she ventured deeper, something began to change. The trees around her grew taller and denser, blocking out the sunlight that had previously illuminated her path. The temperature dropped, and a cold wind blew through the branches, bringing an eerie silence. Suddenly, the trail ahead began to vanish. Where there had once been a clear path, there were now only roots and shrubs, as if the forest had swallowed the trail, erasing any trace of it. Mariana looked at her map, confused, and tried to use her compass, but the needle spun wildly as if trapped in an invisible magnetic field. She kept walking, trying to find some point of reference, but everything around her seemed to shift. The trees, which had once been spaced out, now closed in around her like a living wall. The sound of her own footsteps was the only thing she could hear, but the feeling that she was being watched grew stronger with each passing moment. Then the whispers began. Faint at first, almost indistinguishable, but as she walked, they grew clearer. They were soft voices calling her name. Mariana stopped, looking around, trying to figure out where they were coming from. Mariana? The voices said, coming from all directions. Her heart raced, and she tried to stay calm, convinced that it was just her mind playing tricks. But the voices didn't stop. They mingled with the wind as if carried by it, and suddenly she realized she was no longer alone. In the distance between the trees, shadows moved. Human forms, but distorted, as if they were reflections of people trapped in a nightmare. They watched her from afar, silent but always present. Mariana tried to call for help, but her voice seemed to vanish into the air, as if the forest itself was muffling any sound she made. Panicking, she began to run. No matter which direction she went, the shadows followed her, always at the edge of her vision. The air around her grew heavy, and the sense of being swallowed by the forest increased. The trees moved, the roots stretched to grab at her feet. Mariana stumbled, falling onto the ground covered in leaves and roots. The impact was hard, but the fear that gripped her was even more intense. She quickly tried to get up, but her legs were being held by the roots, which coiled around her as if the forest itself were alive, trying to hold her in place. The sense that something was terribly wrong was overwhelming. The shadows that had only watched from afar were now slowly approaching, and the whispers around her grew louder. Mariana struggled to free herself from the roots, but with each attempt, the ground beneath her seemed to shift, as if the forest were coming to life, pulling her deeper into its depths. The cold around her intensified, and the whispers were no longer just voices calling her name. They told dark secrets, things she could never fully understand. It was as if the forest was whispering the stories of those who had been lost there before her, those whose souls still wandered, trapped in the place. Finally, with a desperate effort, she managed to free herself from the roots and started running, with no sense of direction, just trying to escape. But no matter where she went, the forest seemed endless, as if she were trapped in a labyrinth of trees and shadows. With each step, the terrain became harder to traverse. Dense vegetation grew around her, blocking her vision and leaving her even more disoriented. Mariana lost track of time. She didn't know how long she had been running or in which direction she was going. The sun, which had once shone brightly in the sky, was now completely obscured by the tree canopies. The sky darkened rapidly, as if night had fallen without warning. The only light left was a faint glow coming from between the trees, something that beckoned her like a flame. Exhausted, with no other option, she decided to follow the glow. What she found was a clearing, but not an ordinary one. In the center was a circle of ancient stones, covered in moss and etched with strange symbols. In the middle of the circle, there was a sort of stone altar, and on it, an old book, its pages yellowed with age. The glow she had seen came from the book, which seemed to pulse faintly as if it were alive. Mariana moved closer, feeling a mixture of fascination and terror. There was something deeply wrong about the place, but her curiosity led her toward the book. As she reached out to touch it, she felt a chill run through her entire body. When she opened the book, its pages began to turn by themselves, as if an invisible force were flipping them. On one of the pages, words in an unknown language glowed, and the whispers around her grew louder, more urgent. Suddenly, the shadows that had been following her began to emerge from the darkness, forming humanoid figures. Their bodies were skeletal, their faces completely devoid of any human features, just dark holes where their eyes should have been. They moved toward Mariana, surrounding her, and she realized that these were the lost, the souls the forest had claimed over the centuries. They were doomed to wander that place forever with no hope of escape, and now they wanted her to join them. Despair filled Mariana. She tried to close the book, but an invisible force held it open. The shadows drew nearer and nearer, and their whispers turned into silent screams. When one of the figures reached out for her, an unbearable cold washed over her body. It was as if the forest itself was draining her life, sucking away her energy. Mariana fell to her knees, feeling her strength leave her. She looked up at the sky, which was now completely dark, and the last thing she saw before losing consciousness was the circle of shadows around her, waiting to claim her soul. The next morning, the forest was peaceful as always. The villagers who lived nearby knew that Mariana would not return. They had warned her, but like so many before her, she had ignored the warnings and entered the forest of the lost. And like all the others, she had disappeared, becoming just another soul to wander the shadowy depths of the forest, lost forever. Story 3: The Mirror of Eternity. In an old antique shop in the city center, there was a mirror that no one dared to buy. It had been there for so long that it had become part of the store's decor, its presence almost forgotten by visitors. The mirror had a gold frame adorned with mysterious and intricate figures, which seemed to tell a story lost to time. But the most disturbing thing wasn't the frame, it was the reflection in the mirror itself. The surface of the glass appeared clearer and deeper than any other mirror, almost as if it invited those who looked into it to lose themselves in its depths. Beatrice, a woman passionate about ancient artifacts, was searching for something unique for her collection. When she entered the shop, her eyes were immediately drawn to the mirror. She felt a strange connection to the object, something inexplicable. The shop owner, an elderly man with a weary look, noticed her interest and warned her in a grave voice, "This mirror is not like the others. It holds secrets, and those who own it end up discovering things they wish they hadn't." Beatrice, however, didn't believe in superstitions. She saw the mirror as nothing more than a beautiful piece of art and decided to buy it, ignoring the old man's warning. The mirror was brought to her home and placed in the master bedroom, where she could admire it every day. On the first night, while getting ready for bed, Beatrice looked more closely at the mirror. Something in the surface seemed to move, as if the reflection was slightly distorted. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but everything appeared normal again. Over the next few days, however, things began to change. Every time she passed by the mirror, she felt a strange sensation, as if she were being watched. And then the dream started. In her dreams, Beatrice saw herself trapped inside the mirror, banging desperately on the surface, trying to escape, while a version of her, but different, with a dark and empty gaze, watched her from outside. She woke up every night with her heart racing and her body covered in cold sweat. The dreams were so vivid that she could feel the cold glass against her hands, the rising panic as she struggled to get out. During the day, she avoided looking directly at the mirror, but the feeling of being watched never left her. One night, as she lay in bed, she heard a soft sound like the rustling of fabric. When she opened her eyes, what she saw froze her with fear. The version of herself that she had seen in her dreams was standing outside the mirror, watching her with a sinister smile. Beatrice tried to scream, but no sound came out, as if something was preventing her from making any noise. The figure, now fully outside the mirror, moved slowly toward the bed, while Beatrice's real reflection was still trapped inside the glass, pounding desperately. The lights in the room flickered, and the shadowy figure extended a hand toward Beatrice. When its cold fingers touched her arm, she felt an overwhelming emptiness, as if her soul was being sucked into the mirror. In the last moment, Beatrice managed to break free and leaped out of bed, running toward the door. When she turned to look at the mirror again, the dark figure had disappeared, but her reflection in the mirror still watched her, with terror in its eyes. In the following days, Beatrice tried to get rid of the mirror, but no matter how many times she removed it from the house, it would always reappear in the bedroom as if it was a part of her. The terror consumed her, and the dreams, becoming more intense, took over her reality. She knew that soon the mirror would claim her for good, and there would be no escape. Story 4: The Cursed Key. In a small village in the English countryside, Julio, a young antiquities collector, came across a curious object at a local fair. An old key forged from dark iron and adorned with symbols he couldn't decipher. The vendor, an elderly man with a tired look, warned that the key wasn't just an ordinary artifact. It opened something that should remain closed, the man said almost as a whisper. Julio, however, laughed off the warning and, intrigued by the mystery, bought the key. When he returned home, he placed the key on a table, admiring its rustic beauty and the enigmatic aura it radiated. In the days that followed, Julio's curiosity grew. He began researching the origins of similar keys, trying to find information about the symbols engraved on it, but to no avail. The key seemed unique, something that didn't belong to any specific time or place. One night, while exploring his basement, Julio found something he had never expected: a door. It wasn't just any door, but an old, dark wooden one marked by time with a lock that seemed to match the key perfectly. He couldn't recall ever seeing the door before, and suddenly the vendor's warning echoed in his mind. But the desire to explore the unknown outweighed his caution. With the key in hand, Julio approached the door. The air in the basement was colder than the rest of the house, and a sense of unease settled over him, as if something was watching his every move. He inserted the key into the lock, which turned effortlessly. The door creaked open slowly, revealing a dark corridor that stretched ahead of him, the smell of dampness and mold filling his nostrils. The corridor seemed endless, the walls covered with symbols similar to those on the key. As he walked, Julio began to hear a low sound, like the echo of chains being dragged. His heart beat heavily in his chest, but his curiosity pushed him forward. The sound grew louder, and he started to realize that the corridor wasn't as empty as it seemed. Shadows moved at the edges of his vision, deformed and twisted figures that shouldn't be seen. Finally, the corridor led him to a circular room, dimly lit by a faint, diffuse light that seemed to have no clear source. In the center of the room stood a stone altar, and on it, a book. The air in the room was heavy, oppressive, and Julio felt a dark presence all around him, as if something was waiting for him. The sound of chains was now deafening, as if something huge and invisible was approaching. He moved toward the altar, feeling a mix of fascination and terror. The book lay open, its pages filled with symbols he didn't understand. Before he could react, an invisible force pushed him back, making him fall to the ground. Julio tried to get up, but it was as if the room itself was alive, trapping him. The shadows on the walls began to move, creeping closer to him as a low, distorted laugh echoed through the room. Desperate, Julio ran back through the corridor, but the door he had opened was now locked. The air grew colder, and he felt something cold touch the back of his neck. Slowly turning around, he saw a giant, hooded figure approaching, holding chains that seemed to be attached to something invisible. The figure stared at him with hollow eyes, and the chains dragged toward him as if they were meant to bind him there forever. He wanted to scream, but no sound came out. When the chains finally reached him, they wrapped around him, an indescribable terror gripping his heart. All he felt was the cold of the chains tightening around his wrists and ankles, dragging him into the darkness. The last thing he saw was the door closing behind him, locking him away in that cursed place forever. The next day, when Julio's friends came looking for him, he was nowhere to be found, and the key was back on the table. The door in the basement was gone, as if it had never existed. The mystery surrounding the key deepened, and now it waited for its next victim, ready to open what should have remained closed. Story 5: The Train to Nowhere. At the heart of an abandoned train station, a local legend circulated about a train that appeared at midnight, always empty and with no known destination. Those who dared to board it were never seen again, and the train, instead of taking passengers to any recognizable place, transported them to a realm where time didn't exist. The station's name was forgettable, but the stories about the train were legendary, passed down through generations, always with the same warning: never board the midnight train. Ricardo, a curious skeptic, heard these stories during a visit to a nearby small town. True to his nature, he decided to debunk the myth. To him, it was nothing more than local superstition, fueled by tales and irrational fears. Armed with his camera, a flashlight, and a notebook, he decided to spend the night at the station, waiting for the train to arrive. The station was deserted, covered in mold and grime, with rusted benches and a deep silence only broken by the wind blowing through the broken windows. Ricardo settled onto one of the benches, anxious and confident that the night would pass uneventfully. However, as midnight approached, something changed. The wind stopped blowing, and the air became heavy, as if the station itself was waiting for something. Suddenly, a distant sound cut through the silence, a soft, almost imperceptible whistle that made the hairs on the back of Ricardo's neck stand on end. He stood quickly, focusing his gaze on the horizon of the tracks. An old train with a classic locomotive design slowly emerged from the darkness, its windows black and its cars seemingly empty. The metal screeched as the train approached the platform and then came to a smooth stop, as if waiting for passengers. Without hesitation, Ricardo boarded, convinced that this was nothing more than an old, abandoned train that someone had reactivated as part of a hoax. Once inside, though, he noticed something strange. The train's interior was surprisingly well preserved, with red velvet seats and heavy curtains, but there was a disturbing silence in the air. The dim lights barely illuminated the corridors, and although he was completely alone, Ricardo felt as if he was not. He walked through the cars, exploring every corner. There was a faint smell of mold, but nothing to explain the growing unease in his chest. As he moved forward, he noticed that the windows, instead of showing the outside of the station, reflected only total darkness, a void that didn't move, as if the train were suspended in nothingness. Suddenly, the train began to move. Without warning, the tracks groaned, and Ricardo lost his balance for a moment. He looked out the windows, expecting to see the station disappearing in the distance, but all he saw was the same oppressive void. He ran to the door of the car and tried to open it, but it was locked, as if the train had decided he could no longer leave. It was then that he began to hear something, a faint murmur, followed by what sounded like footsteps echoing through the cars. He looked around but was still alone. The sound, however, didn't stop. It seemed to come from all directions, and Ricardo's chest tightened with fear. He tried to laugh it off, telling himself it was just the noise of the wheels on the tracks, but the murmurs grew louder, now clearly forming words, though he couldn't understand what they were saying. At the end of one of the cars, Ricardo saw something that made him freeze. Sitting on one of the benches was a man in a black suit, with a wide-brimmed hat that hid his face. The man was motionless, facing away from him. Ricardo called out to him, asking if he knew what was happening, but received no response. Approaching cautiously, he reached out to touch the man's shoulder, but the moment he did, the figure simply disintegrated, turning into dust and leaving the empty suit behind on the bench. Panic surged through Ricardo. He ran through the cars, trying to find a way out, but the doors were sealed, and the windows impenetrable by the darkness outside. The train continued its journey with no apparent destination, and the murmurs were now accompanied by whispers calling his name. He looked out one of the windows and for a brief moment saw his own reflection, but it wasn't him. The figure in the reflection watched him with empty eyes and a sinister smile. Ricardo tried to break the window, but every blow only echoed as the sound of glass breaking without actually shattering. It was as if the train was playing with him, stretching time and prolonging his agony. The car felt like it was closing in on him, becoming more and more claustrophobic, and the whispers were now constant, repeating his name like a macabre chant. Hours passed, or perhaps only minutes, as time had lost all meaning inside that cursed train. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the train came to a stop again. The doors creaked open and Ricardo, exhausted and trembling, stumbled out. When he stood up, he realized he was no longer at the station but in a place he didn't recognize. The sky above was a dull gray with no stars or moon, and the ground beneath his feet was white sand, devoid of any sign of life. The wind was still, and the silence was as deep as it had been on the train. Ricardo looked back, expecting to see the station or the tracks, but there was nothing, only the void that surrounded him. He walked for hours, but the scenery never changed. There was no landmark, no sign of life, only the growing despair in his chest. Finally, he understood. The train hadn't taken him to a new station or any place familiar. It had transported him to a realm beyond reality, where time and space didn't exist. He was trapped there, forever, condemned to wander aimlessly, just like all the others who had boarded the train before him. And as he walked through that endless desert, Ricardo could still hear the train's whistle, echoing in the distance, a cruel reminder that he would never return home. Story 6. The House of Shadows. At the end of a deserted street in a town that seemed to have been forgotten by time, there was an old and imposing house, now in ruins. Its windows were broken and covered in dust, its doors boarded up with wooden planks, as if trying to prevent something from escaping. The house was avoided by everyone who lived there, for it was said to be inhabited by shadows that did not belong to this world, entities that moved between the walls and devoured the light. No one knew exactly what had happened in that house, but one thing was certain. Everyone who had dared to enter never came out. The children in the town told stories of how, at night, you could see human-shaped shadows dancing behind the windows, as if lost people were trapped inside but no longer alive. Some swore they could hear distant laughter and whispers calling out to them, but no one dared to get close enough to confirm. Manuela was a young photographer who didn't believe in ghost stories. She had a passion for exploring abandoned places and capturing them in photographs, and when she heard about the House of Shadows, she saw it as the perfect opportunity to expand her portfolio. Ignoring the warnings from the locals, she decided to spend the night inside the house, documenting whatever she found there. As night fell, Manuela approached the house, her footsteps echoing down the empty street. The wind whistled through the dry trees, and the sound of her boots on the asphalt was the only noise breaking the oppressive silence. The front door was boarded up, but she found a side entrance, a partially broken window that allowed her to slip inside. Upon entering, Manuela felt the air grow dense and cold. The house was completely dark, except for a faint light that seemed to come from the upstairs, as if someone had lit a candle. She wondered if another explorer might be there, but decided to investigate quietly. Climbing the creaking stairs, she moved toward the source of the light, her camera always ready to capture any detail. When she reached the top of the stairs, the light suddenly vanished, leaving her in total darkness. The silence was absolute, and for a moment, Manuela felt utterly alone until she heard the first sound. A faint whisper coming from one of the rooms. "Who's there?" she called, trying to keep her voice steady, but there was no response. Instead, the whisper intensified as if several voices were speaking at once, all too soft to be understood. Determined to find the source, she approached the door to the room from where the sound seemed to be coming. The door was ajar, and when she pushed it gently, it opened with a long, drawn-out creak. Inside, everything was covered in dust. Old furniture and a broken bed filled the space. But what caught her attention was the mirror on the opposite wall. Manuela moved closer to the mirror, and to her surprise, she didn't see her own reflection. Instead, the mirror reflected a dark figure standing in the corner of the room, a human-shaped shadow that wasn't really there. She turned quickly, expecting to see someone, but the room was empty. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow had moved, now closer. Her heart raced. She took a step back, trying to understand what was happening. The shadow in the mirror kept approaching, and that was when she saw something terrifying. The shadow wasn't just any figure. It was imitating her movements, but with a slight delay. Every move Manuela made was reflected by the shadow in the mirror, but the shadow seemed to be getting closer and closer. Trying to stay calm, she decided to leave the room, but before she could move, the door slammed shut with force as if pushed by something invisible. The whispering grew louder, and the shadow in the mirror came closer with each second. Its eyes, which shouldn't have been there, glowing faintly with a malevolent light. Manuela tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. She banged on it hard, trying to call for help, but the whisper surrounded her, muffling any sound she made. When she looked back at the mirror, the shadow was just inches away, and it was then that she saw, with horror, that the shadow was her, but without a soul, a distorted and empty version of herself that was waiting for her. The shadow finally reached her, and the moment they touched, the lights in the house flickered and everything went dark. Manuela felt an intense cold wash over her, and an overwhelming sense of emptiness consumed her. When the whispers stopped and the door finally opened, the house was in complete silence. The next morning, when locals came to check what had happened, they found the house empty. The only thing left was Manuela's camera, lying on the floor, its photos showing blurry, distorted images of shadows dancing on the walls. Story 7, The Wailing Well. On the outskirts of a remote village, there was an ancient stone well, overgrown with thick vegetation and neglected for decades. The village elders told dark stories about the well, claiming that it was a gateway to the world of the dead, a place where condemned souls wailed for eternity. No one dared to approach it, except for those who didn't believe in old superstitions or were too naive to understand the danger. Lucas, a young man who always challenged fears and local legends, decided to explore the well. He had heard the story since childhood but had never seen anything to prove them true. So, on a gloomy autumn afternoon, Lucas set out for the place where the well was hidden, deep in a dense forest. The sky was overcast and the air was damp as though a storm was about to begin. As he approached the well, he noticed the atmosphere changing. The forest, once alive with the sounds of birds and animals, grew strangely silent. The trees around the well were taller and more twisted, their dark, dry leaves whispering secrets long forgotten. The well was just as described in the stories, ancient, covered in moss, with weathered stones. The mouth of the well was wide, bordered by uneven rocks, and the bottom was invisible, concealed by darkness that seemed to swallow any light. Lucas leaned over the edge, shining his flashlight into the well, but the beam barely penetrated the deep black void. He felt a chill run down his spine but dismissed the discomfort, convinced that it was just fear trying to take hold of him. He knelt by the well's edge and tossed a small rock down, waiting to hear the sound of it hitting the bottom. But there was nothing. The well seemed bottomless. Intrigued, Lucas took a rope from his backpack, tied it to one of the stones around the well, and began carefully descending along the inside. As he went lower, the air became colder and more humid, filled with the musty smell of wet earth. He had descended several meters and still couldn't see the bottom. His flashlight began to flicker, casting weak, irregular light. That's when he heard it for the first time, a soft wail like the distant crying of a person. Lucas froze, gripping the rope tightly, straining to hear more clearly. The sound grew louder, nearer, and soon he realized it wasn't just one person wailing. There were many voices, all lamenting in unison, forming a chorus of sorrow and pain. Lucas looked upward, considering climbing back out, but his curiosity drove him to continue. He had to know what was down there. The further he descended, the stronger the wails became, until he finally felt his feet touch something solid. The bottom of the well was made of smooth stone, but the intense cold radiating from it was alarming. His breath came out in small, white puffs in the freezing air. Suddenly, his flashlight died completely, plunging him into total darkness. The wails now surrounded him as though the voices were circling, whispering his name. "Lucas, why did you come here?" The voice was soft, but it dripped with sadness. Lucas fumbled with the flashlight, but his trembling fingers couldn't work the switch. Panic crept in when something cold brushed his shoulder. He spun around quickly but saw nothing. The touch, though, had been real. Then he saw them, translucent figures emerging from the walls of the well, pale faces distorted in anguish, their mouths open in silent screams. These beings were no longer human, or at least not anymore. They were the souls of those who had been drawn to the well, condemned to remain there forever, their spirits trapped in an endless cycle of despair. The voices turned into desperate shrieks, and Lucas felt the ground beneath his feet start to tremble. Desperate to escape, he grabbed hold of the rope and began to climb as fast as he could, feeling the icy hands of the souls trying to pull him back. Every meter he ascended, the weight of the darkness increased, as though something was dragging him down. His arms burned with the effort, but he didn't stop. At last, after what felt like an eternity, he managed to reach the edge of the well and threw himself onto the ground, gasping for breath. The silence outside was deafening compared to the screams within the well. When he looked up, something caught his attention. The rope he had used to descend was frayed, as though it had been rotting away. It disintegrated in his hands. Lucas ran through the forest without looking back, the wails of the trapped souls echoing in his mind. From that day on he was never the same. Nightmares haunted him every night, and he could hear the wails even when awake, as if the souls from the well were calling for him. No one believed his story, but he knew the truth. The well was alive, and those who heard its wails never truly escaped. Story 8. The Cursed Statue. In a small coastal town, there was a square with an ancient marble statue at its center, depicting a man holding a set of scales, like a dark version of justice. The locals said the statue had stood there for as long as anyone could remember, and no one knew who had placed it there. Most people avoided spending too much time near the statue, as it emanated a strange aura of sorrow and doom. Some claimed that anyone who touched the statue would be haunted by inexplicable tragedies. Isabella, a young journalist new to the town, didn't believe these stories. She was determined to uncover the truth about the statue's origins, and perhaps write an intriguing article for her paper. So, on a cloudy afternoon, she went to the square to investigate more closely. When she arrived, she noticed the square was eerily empty, despite being in the town center. The statue, imposing and cold, seemed to watch her, its empty stone eyes fixed on the horizon. Isabella circled the statue, examining its details. The marble was worn in places, but the features of the man carved into it were perfect, almost lifelike. She snapped a few photos, made some notes, and then impulsively reached out and touched the base of the statue. The marble was icy, colder than the air around her. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, she felt a chill sweep through her entire body. That night, back home, Isabella began to feel strange. A sense of unease settled over her, as though she were being watched. She tried to ignore it, convincing herself that it was just fatigue. But as the night wore on, the feeling intensified. The shadows in her room seemed deeper, and she began hearing whispers coming from the hallway. Isabella got up to investigate but found no one. The uneasiness persisted, and the silence in her house felt oppressive. When she returned to her bedroom, she caught a glimpse of a man standing near the window. Her heart raced, but when she blinked, the figure was gone. She convinced herself she was imagining things, but the presence lingered. In the days that followed, Isabella's life began to fall apart. Small accidents and bizarre events occurred. First, she slipped and fell at home for no apparent reason. Then she began losing important items, and soon her job at the newspaper was in jeopardy due to a mistake she swore she hadn't made. But the most unsettling part was the constant feeling of being followed. She saw strange shadows out of the corner of her eye and heard slow footsteps around her bed at night. Determined to understand what was happening, Isabella delved deeper into researching the statue. She discovered that, centuries ago, the town had been the site of an arbitrary trial. The man depicted by the statue had been a cruel judge, notorious for sentencing innocent people to death based on false accusations. As punishment for his wickedness, he had been cursed, turned to stone, destined to stand as a symbol of suffering forever. Those who touched the statue were doomed to experience inexplicable misfortunes, carrying the curse of the merciless judge with them. Desperate, Isabella returned to the square to try to reverse the curse. It was late at night and the square was empty. As she approached the statue, she noticed something that horrified her. The statue's stone eyes had shifted to look directly at her, with a gaze full of disdain. The marble that had been cold now seemed to pulse, almost as if it were alive. She tried to back away, but her legs gave out beneath her. Then she heard a raspy voice coming from the statue itself. "You touched what you should not have. Now you carry my sentence." The words didn't come from outside but from within her mind, and the terror overwhelmed her, bringing her to her knees. The last thing she saw before she blacked out was the shadow of the judge slowly moving, as if breaking free from the stone. When Isabella was found in the square the next morning, she was in shock, mumbling incoherently. She was never the same again. The statue, however, remained in its place, unmoving and cold, but the townsfolk swore that now, on rare occasions, they could see the shadow of the judge moving at night, as if searching for his next victim. Story 9, The House of Moths. In a small, secluded town, there was a house that everyone avoided. Known as the House of Moths, its reputation was as old as the town itself. People said that on the darkest nights, giant moths would gather at the house's windows, and those who entered never returned. The moths, it was believed, were ancient spirits trapped there, and their presence foretold the impending doom of anyone foolish enough to trespass. Hugo, a young man fascinated by the paranormal, decided it was time to investigate the legend. He had always been interested in mysteries and urban legends, and the story of the moths intrigued him. Ignoring the warnings of the locals, he prepared his recording equipment and set off for the house on an especially dark night when the moon was hidden by thick clouds. When he arrived, he noticed the house was much larger than he had imagined. Its wooden walls were weathered by time, and as the legend said, the windows were covered by large, silent moths, their wings gently tapping against the glass. Hugo approached the door, feeling the weight of the silence around him. The moths didn't move, but he had the distinct feeling they were watching him. With a mix of excitement and fear, Hugo entered the house. The interior was even more eerie, with furniture draped in dusty sheets and the air thick with the scent of mold and decay. He switched on his flashlight and began to explore. The walls of the house seemed strange, as though there was something hidden behind them, something he couldn't quite see. However, what disturbed him most was the constant fluttering sound. Though he was alone, the unmistakable noise of moths moving filled the air. He began taking pictures, capturing the ghostly aura of the place. But with every step he took, the sound of the wings grew louder. He ascended the stairs, believing the noise was coming from the upper floor. At the top of the staircase, Hugo noticed something odd. At the end of the hallway, a door was sealed shut with thick iron chains. Curious, he approached, and as he inspected the chains, he felt a cold breeze pass by, as though something had moved through the house. When he turned around, he saw that the giant moths had started to emerge from the cracks in the walls. They beat their wings slowly, as though waking from a long slumber. Hugo, now gripped by panic, tried to retrace his steps, but the moths were everywhere, filling the hallways and surrounding him from all sides. These moths weren't just insects, he realized too late. There was something human about them, an evil intelligence guiding their movements. Their eyes, which he hadn't noticed before, gleamed with a faint, sinister light, and Hugo felt as though he were being watched by something far older and more dangerous than mere nocturnal creatures. Desperate, he ran toward the front door, but it wouldn't open. The moths swarmed around him, closing in, their wings filling the air with an almost unbearable pressure. Hugo collapsed to his knees, feeling himself losing control of his body as the moths pressed closer. The next morning, when some curious townsfolk finally approached the house, they found the door ajar, but Hugo was gone. The moths, once covering the windows, were completely still, as though in mourning. From that day on, no one dared to enter the House of Moths again, and on the rare occasions when someone did try, it was said that the moths stirred once more, waiting for their next victim. Story 10, The Room in the Old Mansion. At the top of a hill, surrounded by dense forest, stood an old mansion that had been abandoned for decades. It was said that the mansion was haunted by the spirit of its last owner, a lonely woman who lived there until her death. No one knew exactly how she died, but the rumors ranged from murder to suicide. Either way, the house was avoided by all. However, when a group of friends gathered to talk about the mansion, they decided it would be fun to spend the night there as a dare. Among them were Joao, Marcella, and Victor, all of whom were skeptical of ghosts and supernatural legends. With backpacks full of flashlights and snacks, they set off for the mansion as the night began to fall. The path to the house was difficult, and the forest surrounding it seemed alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. When they reached the mansion, its grand but decaying facade loomed over them in an oppressive silence. The front door was slightly ajar, as though the house had been waiting for them. Inside, the mansion was in ruins, but still retained a sense of old grandeur. Broken chandeliers, fogged mirrors, and dust-covered furniture gave the place a melancholic air of abandonment. They decided to explore the first floor before settling in for the night. As they explored, they came upon a room that felt different from the others. The doors were heavier, the interior better preserved, as though time hadn't touched it. In the center of the room was a bed with old linens, and a large gilded mirror took up the opposite wall. Something about the room made them uneasy, though they couldn't quite explain what it was. It was Marcella who suggested they spend the night there. After all, the room seemed the most comfortable in the house. They set up their sleeping bags on the floor and after a few nervous laughs tried to sleep. But as soon as the lights were out, something changed. The air grew thick and an unsettling feeling crept over them. João was the first to notice. He heard a faint rustling sound like the swish of fabric coming from the corner of the room. When he turned on his flashlight, there was nothing there, but the sound persisted. The three of them stayed silent, listening intently. Then the door to the room which they had closed slowly creaked open on its own. They froze. Something was wrong. Marcella glanced at the mirror and, with a scream, pointed at its surface. The reflection in the mirror didn't match what was in the room. In the reflection, there was a figure sitting on the bed, a woman with long, disheveled hair, her face obscured by shadow. Before they could react, the door slammed shut with a loud bang, and their flashlights began to flicker. The figure in the mirror stood up and began walking slowly toward them, but when they looked at the bed, it was still empty. The reflection, however, showed the woman coming closer and closer. Terrified, they tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. The mirror was now only a few feet away, and the woman inside it watched them with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to pull them in. When they finally managed to wrench the door open, they ran through the mansion, not daring to look back. Yet as they fled, they could hear low laughter behind them, followed by a whisper, "You will return? Everyone does." Since that night, no one has dared approach the mansion. And for those brave enough to pass by at night, it's said that a faint light can be seen glowing from one of the rooms, with a mysterious figure watching from the window. If you've made it this far, don't forget to smash that like button to support the channel, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest. See you in the next story.